Exposure compensation is a camera setting that allows you to lighten or darken a photo just before you're about to take it. Before I explain exactly what it is, this is what it usually looks like on the back of the camera. It's a bar with a plus sign to the right or on top and a minus on the left or at the bottom, depending on your camera. Also, there's a pointer that starts off in the middle. Different cameras show it in different ways. It looks quite different even on another Nikon camera. There's more on the actual mechanics of changing the setting towards the end of this film. You've probably discovered by now that your camera can make the most appalling mess of your exposures, so that through no fault of your own you end up with a photo where parts of it at least are either too dark or too bright. It may be a lovely bright day and yet the photo is too dark. Your first thought might be that your camera is faulty, but no, what you've actually done is fooled the camera's metering system. Now that can happen because when the camera is figuring out the exposure in any of its auto modes, it brings together the bright areas in the frame and the dark areas, and it averages them out to a kind of a mid-grey. Now okay, I realise that sounds a bit daft. I'm not suggesting the camera tries to make the image grey in colour, just that it attempts to create an average exposure to give a mid-tone image. In many scenes there are some bright areas and some dark areas, and so this averaging out method usually works just fine to give a good exposure. But if you take a photo of something that is predominantly bright or predominantly dark, the camera can get it very wrong. So here we have my lovely wife standing in front of some small trees and shrubs here in our garden, and the tones of the background are quite dark. The lens on the video camera is zoomed in and she's going to walk across the grass while the camera zooms out to take in more of the sky. Now the video camera is set to its auto mode and so will react just like any DSLR camera. The sky started off white but now has far more detail in it, and although the image looks correctly exposed for the sky and a small part of the garden, if Jane was the main subject I think she might be a little bit disappointed. So that's quite typical of how you can fool your camera's metering system, just by placing your subject in front of a bright sky or other bright background. The camera will see that background and just make everything slightly darker, and so your subject is going to be too dark. Let's take that one step further. To demonstrate what the camera is actually doing, I'm pointing this camera at some black material and I put some white paper over half of the material. Now I've set this camera to aperture priority f5.6 and it's giving me a shutter speed of 125th of a second. So let's take this shot. Now as you can see, the material does look quite black and the paper quite white. So it's a good correct exposure. Now I'll move away the white paper and take another shot. The camera has seen that the overall image has now got darker, and so it automatically slowed the shutter speed to a 20th of a second in order to allow in more light, and the black cloth has now turned grey. But when you think about it, the actual light on that black cloth didn't change, so there was really no need for the camera to adjust anything. I'll now photograph the white paper on its own. The camera's metering reacted to the light paper and changed the shutter speed to 640th of a second, still at f5.6. And would you believe it, now the white paper has turned grey too. That was quite surprising, wasn't it? Obviously you'd have to be some kind of madcap artist to go around photographing bits of paper and fabric on their own. That was an extreme example. A more typical example might be, say, a friend on a beach. They have bright sky, sea or sand behind them. You take the photo and your friend turns out too dark. Also, just think how many snowy photos you've seen recently that were muddy and grey rather than white. The metering system had been fooled by all that lovely white snow. Or how about this? You're taking a picture of somebody very handsome against a dark hedge, but when the person comes into the picture, suddenly their face is a little bit too bright and they don't look quite as handsome anymore. Well, in fact, I'm wearing a dark shirt, so that has kind of accentuated the effect. But if we ask Wilfie to come into the picture, because Wilfie's wearing a white shirt, the camera has closed the aperture down a little bit to make the whole scene a little bit darker. So you can see now that having predominantly dark or bright areas in the frame affects the exposure, and exposure compensation is what you would normally use to get around the problem. Why? Well, there's no point in simply adjusting the aperture or shutter speed or ISO, because in any auto mode the camera will simply compensate by adjusting one of the other settings. For example, if the subject is too bright, like I was earlier, using a smaller aperture to allow in less light would do you no good at all, because the camera would automatically choose a slower shutter speed to keep the overall exposure the same. It's like a balancing act with the camera attempting to keep whatever it thinks is the correct exposure. This brings me neatly on to exposure compensation. Nearly all cameras, including compacts, have this setting, and it's used really just to brighten or darken the resulting photo. It's very easy to do, but the actual mechanics of changing exposure compensation obviously varies from one camera to the next. First, you usually need to be out of the auto mode in order to be able to use exposure compensation, which, by the way, is another good reason for not using full auto. Typically there's a button on the top or back of the camera which has a small plus or minus sign. You press the button, and as you saw earlier, depending on the camera, you turn a dial or wheel to adjust the exposure compensation amount. Moving towards the plus side will brighten the image, whereas the minus side will darken it. A good starting point is usually around plus or minus 1. Try taking another picture and adjust the exposure compensation again if necessary. Don't forget to turn it back to 0 again afterwards. By the way, there's no real magic involved by the camera when you move the dial. All it's doing is changing the aperture or the shutter speed. Now, if you're in aperture priority mode, it will change the shutter speed, and if you're in shutter speed priority mode, it will change the aperture. If you need to get good exposures in some difficult lighting settings, exposure compensation is very important. So play around with the camera, get to know the controls, and then go out and practice with it. Bye for now.